let's just look at some of that. We'll look at Leviticus chapter 18. So let's turn to Leviticus 18 together. And I'm going to show you how Israel was warned not to do certain things. And we'll pick it up in verse 21. Verse 21 reads, "And thou shalt not let any of thy seed pass through the fire to Molech, neither shalt thou profane the name of thy God. I am the Lord." Yes, that's right. The nations around Israel would let their seed pass through the fire to Molech. What does that mean exactly? Molech was a god of fire. And the seed was the children, the babies, were not to pass through the fire to Molech. Moses was telling the Israelites that this was a very, very wrong thing to do. If it was so wrong for him to tell them, it must have been a practice going on around them. Because, believe it or not, Israel had to be taught not to do this. Believe it or not, they had to be taught not to put their children in the fire to this fire god. "Neither shalt thou profane the name of the Lord of God. I am the Lord." Pick it up in verse 24. "Defile not ye yourself in any of these things, for in all these the nations are defiled." The nations around Israel was defiled by all these kind of practices. And there's many in the list before, but I'm going to focus on certain ones. So they were all practicing sacrificing children to the fire god, babies. And they would do this on certain times. Now that sounds really like an extreme thing to teach in church, doesn't it? That's heavy duty. Especially for children to see this kind of thing. But it said that these nations were defiled, and he would cast these nations out before Israel. God was going to take them out of the land and let Israel inhabit the land, because these nations were doing some terrible, terrible things. Read on with me. "And the land is defiled, therefore I do visit the iniquity thereof upon it, and the land itself vomiteth out her inhabitants." So what happens is, when the land becomes polluted and defiled with really terrible practices of idolatry, of human sacrifice, of fertility worship, all these kind of things that are listed here, and not keeping of God's laws, the land becomes polluted, and eventually the land will not sustain them anymore. What happens is their society becomes so degraded that invaders can easily come in and prey on them, and they're overrun and overtaken in the land. Reading on, "Ye shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgment, and shall not commit any of these abominations." God considered the things that these nations were practicing as abominations. They were blasphemy before the Lord. They were unclean. That's what abomination would be. Unclean enough to defile the land. "Neither any of your own nation, nor any stranger that sojourneth among you. For all these abominations have the men of the land done." They've done these things, "which were before you, and the land is defiled, that the land spew not you out also, when ye defile it, as it spewed out the nations that were before you." So God is warning Israel, do not take on the practices of the nations around you. If you do, the land will put you out as well. These things are a defilement before God. These things are an abomination before the Lord. Now, that one example of Israel being a unique people before God, to be kept separate and be kept clean and holy as a holy people, obedient to the Lord's ways, made them different from the nations around them. And yet all these practices went on everywhere around Israel. It's kind of the same today. Because we have many practices out in the world today that come from these histories, believe it or not, that are actually at the same times as these sacrifice days. And they're practiced in a much more subtle, kind of fun, amusing way today. But we are to be a separate people and a clean and undefiled people. And just because the other nations around us do these things doesn't mean we have to do them too, does it? We can think for ourselves, and we can be independent enough and informed enough to make our own decisions about what is best. And then we can choose. And we can choose God's way or the wide path, the easy way. Read on with me a little bit more. Let's go to Jeremiah chapter 7. You're all in Jeremiah 7. We'll look at verse 31, and it says, pick it up in verse 30. For the children of Judah have done evil in my sight, saith the Lord. They have set their abominations in the house which is called by my name to pollute it. And they have built the high places of Tophet, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I commanded them not, neither came it into my heart. Wow. So, when it's talked earlier about passing children through the fire, it wasn't just some kind of ritual where they would pass through and come out the other side alive. No, this is speaking of actually burning the children in the fire. And God really hated this practice of the nations. Now let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 18. And again, another warning. Everybody, Deuteronomy 18, we'll look at verse 9. When thou art come into the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not learn to do after the abominations of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone that maketh his son or daughter to pass through the fire, or that useth divination. What's divination? Sorry? It's a form of witchcraft, divination. Right. So, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch. So there shall not be found among you anyone that uses divination, is an observer of times, an enchanter, or a witch. What do you think of those verses? Should anybody here be looking like anything to do with witchcraft?
No.
No.